Welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for our event looking at critical perspectives on Israeli plans of annexation. Just a sort of general overview of how the event's going to work. Professor Omar Dajani will be leading the event for us today and moderating. He will give introductions for each of our speakers and then we will have short talks from our three other speakers. We'll then go into a discussion if there are certain topics that our speakers want to discuss between themselves. And then after that, we'll move to a Q&A. And just for the Q&A session, the way it will work is in the chat. If you have a question, then put in the chat and we will unmute you so that you can ask that question. And obviously be patient with that. We may have lots of questions coming in, so we'll work through those as best as we can. Just one final thing, bit of housekeeping. If you, I think you are all muted, but if you make sure to keep your microphones off when you're not speaking, that'd be great. Thank you to all of our speakers for joining us today. I'll now hand over to Professor Dajani to introduce himself and our other three speakers. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joseph. My name is Omar Dajani. I'm a professor at McGeorge School of Law, University of the Pacific, which is in California. And I worked some years ago, it seems like a long time ago, a different era now, on the Middle East peace process, first as a legal advisor to the Palestinian team in the peace talks with Israel that proceeded under Yasser Arafat and Ehud Barak, and then subsequently working on the United Nations Special Envoy's peace team after the negotiations collapsed. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you, and I bid a good afternoon to everyone tuning in from here in Europe and the Middle East, and a good morning to those of you over in the United States. Our conversation today offers an opportunity for a critical assessment of Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's announced plans to annex parts of the West Bank following on President Trump's so-called Peace to Prosperity plan. As I suspect all of you know, Israel occupied the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, both of which were previously held by Jordan during the June 1967 war. It also occupied the Gaza Strip, as well as Egypt's Sinai Peninsula and Syria's Golan Heights. It bears emphasizing, though, that occupying land is not the same thing as annexing or acquiring it. Occupation is a fairly neutral concept in international law under most circumstances, whereas annexation is strictly prohibited. To acquire or annex territory, a state must not only exercise authority over it, as Israel has done over all of these years, but also demonstrate an intention to hold the territory in question permanently as sovereign. So that is what is at issue at this juncture. And of course, the plans first announced by Prime Minister Netanyahu in the run-up to the first round of elections last year in 2019 in Israel to annex part of the West Bank was not an unprecedented move. Israel annexed in the state's parlance, extended its sovereignty to East Jerusalem in 1980, at the same time greatly extending the city's municipal boundaries. And it annexed the Golan Heights in 1981. Both moves were condemned by the United Nations Security Council when they happened, and they have continued to elicit condemnation from most quarters of the international community, though the Trump administration has expressed a different view with respect to how to characterize those steps and how to consider their consequences with respect to peace over the last couple of years. So we have an opportunity today to hear from three people who are extraordinarily well suited and situated to speak about the implications of the plans that Netanyahu has announced, the likely direction that they will take, and whether we should expect to see them realized, and what their consequences are. I will introduce the speakers as in the order in which they'll speak. And then I will turn it over to them to offer presentations, as Joseph mentioned they would. The first speaker will be my friend, Dr. Khalil Shikaki, who directs the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research based in Ramallah, and is probably the most highly regarded survey research enterprise in Palestine. He holds a PhD in political science from Columbia University and has taught at several universities across Palestine and in the United States, including the University of South Florida in the United States, as I suspect you know, Al-Najah National University in Nablus, and Bir Zeit University just outside of Ramallah. His research concentrates mainly on the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, the Palestinian transition to democracy and state building, and domestic Palestinian politics, for which, as I mentioned earlier, he has conducted hundreds of polls among both Palestinians and Israelis. Admiral Amichay Ayalon served as the head of the Shin Bet, Israel's internal security service, from 1995 to 2000, and subsequently was elected to the Knesset on the Labor Party list. He is a graduate of Bar Ilan University and Harvard University, from which he was awarded a master's in public administration in 1992. And in partnership with Palestinian professor Seri Nasebe, he launched the People's Voice Peace Initiative in 2003, aiming to obtain as many signatures as possible among Israelis and Palestinians in support of a two-state solution. Currently, Ami is also senior fellow at the Israeli Democracy Institute. And finally, my former colleague, Ms. hhusseini, is the chair of the legal committee to final status negotiations between the Palestinians and Israelis, and has served as legal advisor to the peace process negotiations since 1994. Hiba holds a JD from Georgetown University Law Center, as well as master's degrees from George Washington University and the University of the Sorbonne. She is a member of a number of local, regional, and international working groups on the peace process, including those addressing trade and economic relations and the status of Jerusalem, the city where she lives and which she holds dear. She has written widely on the peace process, business law, rule of law, and economic development, and runs a prominent law firm from her offices in Ramallah. So without further ado, allow me to turn the microphone over to Dr. Khalil. Thanks very much for joining us again.
Thank you very much, Omar, and a pleasure to be with all of you. Although the planning for annexation seems at this point to have been paused, I would argue it remains a very potent threat to Israeli-Palestinian relations. Before I get into the implications of the annexation, and since I'm the first speaker, I'll say something about what it means for Palestinians, for Israel to annex about 30% of the West Bank, and what has been the Palestinian response to that threat or that intention to do so. For the Palestinians, the annexation is not only Israel taking away illegally Palestinian land, but there are two particular aspects about annexation that makes the threat even greater. One is that it encircles, with annexing the Jordan Valley, Israel encircles the entire Palestinian entity or territory and denies the Palestinians any land access to in the West Bank, the only Arab neighbor they have, Jordan. Essentially, by encircling the entity, for Palestinians, Israel is essentially making the entity, this Palestinian entity, part of Israel, and not an entity that has the capacity to become independent. The second threat in annexation, as seen by Palestinians, is that with annexation of the settlements, Israel denies any future entity, any future state of any meaningful territorial contiguity. A future Palestinian map would be very much similar to the pre-1994 system of Bantustan in South Africa, one that denies the Palestinians any real sovereignty, but of course enables them some kind of self-governing homelands. The PA response has taken three forms. One is to end security coordination, although this of the three elements that the PA has responded, the PA essentially said we are now absolved of the obligations of Oslo. This has been taken by the Palestinian public to mean that the PA is no longer obligated by the Oslo Agreement, and that it is severing links with the State of Israel. One of those links are security links, and this is, and the second is economic and financial, and the third is civil. So of the three, only security has direct negative implications for Israel because it could eventually lead to a much greater security threats and destabilization in the West Bank and in Israel. The second area of Palestinian response has been basically to put an end to all links, economic links that require coordination with Israel. Most importantly, this means $170, $180 million a month that Israel transfers to the PA is stopped because the PA is not requesting the transfer of this money because the PA is not coordinating with Israel. Obviously, Israel can transfer the money if it wants to. Nothing stops Israel from doing so, but Israel has chosen not to transfer the money. If Israel does transfer the money to a Palestinian bank right now, I'm 100% sure the PA will be happy to take the money. But as long as Israel conditions the transfer of the money to restoration of coordination, the PA will not do it. And of course, there are many other economic and financial aspects of the Palestinian response. All of them hurt the Palestinians. They do not directly hurt Israel. The third response has been in the area of civil affairs. And here too, this in fact hurts the Palestinian public in terms of its threat to daily life, even more so than the economic and financial, because it affects their ability to travel, their ability to have IDs that Israel recognizes, passports, birth certificates, driving licenses, marriages and divorce, everything. All of this is usually coordinated with Israel. The Israeli computers receive information, confirm receipt, and this information then become joint information based on which decisions are made. So why did Abbas do this? The Palestinian leader, who is seen by the Palestinian public as a status quo man, someone who doesn't like to rock the boat until he's forced to do so. Why did he decide to do so? We can only speculate about this, but it seems that the Palestinian president's calculus is built on the assumption that the well-being of the Palestinian Authority is more valuable to Israel today than it is to him, the president of that authority, or to the Palestinian people as a whole. His logic is that the party that benefits more from the PA is basically threatening to abdicate responsibility by abandoning all links in the three areas I've mentioned. He is putting the PA in a position where sooner or later it will collapse. He is basically saying this is Israel has more interest in preventing this collapse. So Israel should blink first. Netanyahu should blink first. In other words, Netanyahu should remove the annexation from the agenda. If he doesn't, then we will escalate our response. The escalation in the response in fact, has already been taken with regard to economic and civil affairs. The only area where there has been no escalation in Palestinian response in the security realm, and I'll come to that in a minute. But if Netanyahu thinks that Abbas benefits more from the PA, that the Palestinians would be crazy to allow the Palestinian Authority to collapse, then this is not rational. So Abbas is a rational person. So if Netanyahu thinks Abbas benefits more, he will wait for Abbas to blink first. Blinking first, in this case, would mean that Abbas would restore coordination even if Israel goes ahead with annexation. This is sort of a game of chicken for now, and it is not being fully played yet because Israel hasn't gone ahead with annexation, but the two sides are preparing themselves for that moment. If we ask the Palestinian public today in our surveys, and we do, by the way, is the PA an asset for the Palestinians or is it a burden? The response in the last 5 years has been almost always consistently, it is a burden for the Palestinians, not an asset. Why? Well, it was supposed to be the midwife to statehood. There is no state so far. There is no end of occupation. It is divided between Gaza and the West Bank. It is corrupt, authoritarian, lacking legitimacy. There is no elections. Service delivery is miserable. So, and of course, finally, Israel is chipping away the jurisdiction of the PA every day. Long ago, it has taken away its internal security jurisdiction in the area is labeled A. More recently, it has started to take away the PA jurisdiction in zoning. Buildings, homes that were built in areas labeled A and B, where the Palestinians have zoning jurisdiction, have been destroyed by the Israelis because the Israelis said these buildings were a security threat. So a security threat was an overriding reason that basically took away the zoning jurisdiction of the PA. So for all these reasons, it seems the Palestinians are coming to the conclusion that if the PA disappears or collapses, that would be fine. In fact, there are some people who say this would be a good thing because the existence of the PA is the assurance for the continuation of the status quo. We need to get rid of it in order for us to be able to move forward. Okay, now I come to the heart of the matter. Why is annexation bad? Annexation, beyond what I've already said in terms of what Palestinians think about it, there are essentially 5 reasons why annexation is bad to Israeli-Palestinian relations. This is not about just what Palestinians alone win or lose. This is about the two sides. And I think the most important is that it is likely to accelerate what's already in place, the dynamics of one-state reality. These dynamics will gradually take over from the dynamics of the two-state solution. This is a major threat. We can get into details later if you like, but for now, I just want to highlight these main likely consequences. The second that I see happening is that with the PA becoming weaker, this will increase the prospect for violent confrontations between Palestinians and Israelis, not only between groups, armed groups that may want to carry out violent attacks, but also between the two security services. Here too, I don't want to go into details, but let me just give you one example. Today, when the Israeli forces, when the IDF units enter, say, Ramallah or Nablus to arrest Palestinians any time of the day, In the past, they used to inform the Palestinian security services. This was part of the coordination. This coordination assured both sides that there will be no miscalculation, that there will be no incidents in which the two sides shoot at each other and so on. Today, there is no such coordination, but on de facto basis, the Palestinian Authority has instructed its own security services to withdraw. The minute they see the Israeli army units in the streets, the security services, the Palestinian security services, are instructed to leave the scene immediately. I'm not sure that this is viable in the long run or tenable in the long run. A single incident in which the two sides begin to shoot at each other will create dynamics of its own. In Area B, the Palestinians, and C, the Palestinian security services, the police, is required to coordinate access to the roads. Today, there is no coordination. What happens if they find themselves right in the middle of the street? So far, there has been no accidents. There has been no clashes between the two security services. If annexation does go ahead, I think we will see escalation in these areas. The third area where I see consequences that are likely to threaten Israeli-Palestinian relations is that with annexation, if annexation does go ahead, this will indeed consolidate the stalemate in Israeli-Palestinian diplomatic process, will make it extremely difficult for any return or any resumption of negotiations. The PA will condition any resumption of negotiations on Israel undoing the annexation it has already done. And that, even if there is a different Israeli government that does not like annexation, it will be extremely difficult for it to abandon annexation. So this could mean that a resumption of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations in the future might not be feasible, assuming that there would be any attempts in the future. The fourth has consequences is about the PA and the likely threat to its stability, perhaps even its existence. I said earlier, 170, $180 million are transferred every month by Israel through coordination. This money is not being transferred right now, which means the PA has to borrow from the bank. By the way, $170 million is 60% or more of the revenues of the Palestinian Authority. Without this money, the PA cannot pay salaries for its own staff, for its own public sector, and not only in the West Bank, but also in Gaza. Every month, the Palestinian Authority transfers $105 million to Gaza. Given conditions in Gaza, if $105 million are no longer being transferred to Gaza, this is a huge disaster. War between Israel and Gaza become almost inevitable. And the misery of Gaza, of course, become worse. So the destabilization of the PA, because the PA is unable to pay money, or because the PA is unable to deliver law and order or internal security, which all of these things are likely to happen as the PA gradually weakens. The fifth consequence that I think is highly detrimental to Israeli-Palestinian relations is the regional implications, the regional ramifications. How does Jordan see this? Well, for Jordan, Israel going ahead with annexation is essentially a message not only to the Palestinians, but also to Jordan, that Jordan is Palestine. That what Israel is doing is creating conditions in the West Bank that will force the Palestinians to look elsewhere for a home and elsewhere for a state. And that the only place where they can look for a state is Jordan, because the majority of Jordanians are of Palestinian origins. For Jordan, this is also an existential threat, just as it is for Palestinians. But even the Palestinians themselves might find themselves, if countries like the Saudis, the Gulf, or even Egypt do not show the kind of support for the Palestinians by taking very serious and effective measures against annexation, against Israel, the Palestinians will see this as the Arab world abandoning them. This could mean regional realignment for the Palestinians. They might be looking for allies elsewhere, whether it's Turkey or Iran or anybody else. One can exclude that possibility. Today, this is not possible, but in the future, one cannot exclude these possibilities. Let me end by simply saying that annexation, particularly because it's part of this more encompassing Trump plan, brings about major paradigm shifts in Israeli-Palestinian relations. It takes away Oslo, it violates Oslo clearly, without replacing it. It takes away the two-state solution without replacing it. It threatens the only means of peaceful ending of the conflict, meaning violence becomes the only inevitable answer for Palestinians, and we see a significant rise in Palestinian support for violence soon after the release of the Trump plan and the threat of annexation becoming more and more serious. And the disappearance of the PA. Who replaces the PA? Would Israel want to come back and take control of the cities of the West Bank and again, therefore assuring an outcome that is definitely not a two-state solution, and not a two-state solution with equal rights, but not a one-state solution with equal rights, but a one-state solution where Palestinians are denied equal rights. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Khalil, for your penetrating comments as usual. Next on the agenda, we have Amichay Ayalon. Ami, please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, every time I enjoy listening to Khalil, and I learn a lot. So you made my day. In a way, unfortunately, I totally agree with his not very optimistic overview. The way I have to remind to the people who doesn't know me, I do not even pretend to represent my government. In Israel, I think that most people know that I oppose my government policy. And so I'm not going to try to defend my prime minister policy now, because this is not what I'm doing even among my friends. So the way I understand the unilateral annexation, it's a concept it's a political concept that came to the world only as because as a political interest of two people, which is the American president and the Israeli prime minister. If I have to try to explain what it's all about, I think that this is my only explanation. People tend to forget, or at least Khalil said something about it, but for me it is a major issue. We are annexing more than 50 years. We are annexing every day. We don't call it gradual or incremental annexation, but this is what we are doing since probably not 67, 68 or 69. Everybody who knows Palestinian and Israeli reality understand it. We are not speaking about it, but everybody understands it. So, excuse me, and I hope you will understand me, there is a major upside in the concept of unilateral annexation, because suddenly we speak about it. Suddenly everybody understands that this is, in a way, in the back of our minds. When I say our minds, I say we Israelis. You cannot explain our energy to build settlements and to send our pioneers to Palestine or to the West Bank or Judea, Samaria, whatever we call it, unless you understand that it is part of an ideology. So yes, for the first time, for many years, suddenly it became part of the political agenda, and people in the public debate are ready to discuss it. So there is some upside about it. I'm not sure we understand it and we are taking advantage because unfortunately, in parallel to the annexation, we are facing a world pandemic and a huge economic crisis. So I believe that, and I'm sad about it, that in the international community, it is not an issue. And I think that no matter what we should do, Israelis and Palestinians who really agree that the only way to live side by side without killing each other every day is within the framework of two states. So I'm worried about moral issues, legal issues, and security issues, but I'm not a philosopher and I'm not a lawyer, so I'll say something about some of the security aspects, the way we understand it in Israel. And when I say we, I'm a member in organizations that we call ourselves. I'm a member in many organizations, but the one that I mentioned now is Commanders for Israel, about 300 generals, admirals, whatever, and all of us, we totally oppose the annexation, and I believe that about 90% of the people who achieve ranks of admiral generals in the past and in the present are totally against it. Again, not because of moral reasons or legal reasons, mainly because of security reasons. And I have to remind you that Netanyahu said already that if and when he will annex, he will not give equal rights to the people who are living in the territories that will be annexed. So the moment that we shall formally annex, we are becoming formally an apartheid state. Whether we are apartheid now or not, it is a huge debate, I believe, by the way, that in the West Bank, we are creating an apartheid reality. But I believe that on the Israeli side, Israel is not an apartheid state within the Green Line. But the moment that we as a state, by the government and parliament decision, annex parts of Judea, Samaria, or the West Bank without giving equal rights, and this is the plan as I know it now, Israel will become formally an apartheid state. And something about the way we understand the immediate and the long run impact on the security side, no matter whether we shall annex the full annexation, which is 30% according to the plan now, or something much less, let's say, I don't know, some areas that in every future agreement will be annexed in the framework of swap, exchange of territories. The way, and I did not change my mind after I heard Khalil, Palestinians will have to react. Now, again, we can believe or we cannot believe to the announcement by Palestinian prime minister or ministers, but the way I understand, and I rely on Khalil polls, the way I understand Palestinians, Palestinians in the street are totally against it. For them, it is the end of a dream. And they will react. Now, the first aspects of violence probably will not be supported by organization, Hamas or the Tanzim of the Fatah. People who are angry will take knife or will take whatever they can in order to kill somebody. We saw it not many years ago, and it will start probably this way, but once it will start, there will be some competition because Hamas will try to lead this energy, violent energy, and the way I understand the leadership of Fatah, they will not let Hamas to lead this energy, and step by step, a gradual process. We shall see it, probably it will not happen in one day, the way we saw during the Second Intifada, but step by step, we shall see a process that will remind us the Second Intifada. The moment that Palestinians will use violence, the IDF will have to respond. Security is something sacred in the eyes of Israelis. Now we shall see clashes between settlers and farmers or Palestinians along the roads. And exactly as Khalil described it, we shall see intervention of the IDF and the way I understand the Palestinian security organizations, not as an order from the PA. But, you know, when I was a director of the Shin Bet, I used to work with not with Khalil because I just read his polls at the time, but with Jibril Rajub and Muhammad Dahlan. And they used to tell me every day, we are cooperating with you. We are not South Lebanese. You are not paying our salary. We are fighting our people, the terrorists of Hamas, only because we believe that in the end of the road, we shall create a two-state reality, two states along by, that side by side. The moment that we or our people will not believe, forget about us. And this will be the reality once they will not have any other chance. If they will have arms, they will use it against everybody, against the Israeli IDF. So I don't know what will happen to the PA. I believe that whether it will collapse formally or will be a kind of a puppet administration, it is almost the same. I don't think that the PA will be able to control this reality. And if you read a very, very important article by Khalil Shikaki, I think it was written about 1 year after the Intifada, explaining the Intifada, the Second Intifada, and this was exactly what we thought in the Shin Bet. But Khalil explained it in academic terms, was not invented by Arafat, but he had to try to lead this energy that came from the street. And this is exactly what we shall see. If the PA will try to lead this energy, probably the PA will, the Palestinian Authority will survive. If the Palestinian Authority will try to stop it, it will not survive. So it is not a very optimistic scenario. Among all the scenarios, we believe that this is the most realistic scenario in case of annexation. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Ami, for your remarks. The final speaker for today is hhusseini. Hiba, welcome, and please take it from here. Great to see you.
Thank you, Omar. It's so good to see you. It's been such a long time.
Yes.
Annexation is a very difficult subject for Palestinians. It elicits a lot of emotion and conjures up the entire history of the conflict, and the lack and indicates the extent to which Israel has been, as you and our other guests have mentioned, annexation has been ongoing. Jerusalem is one, of course, and as you said, I'm a Jerusalemite, and I see every day what's going on, even in my neighborhood, literally on the roads I live, and I see where things are going. So it's very, very unsettling for Palestinians. I think it also, as I said, stems from all these unilateral actions that Israel continues to take, and now has Netanyahu, of course, has sought, and his team have sought the support of President Trump to legitimize the step in the so-called deal of the century. Omar, you alluded to the fact that annexation infringes international law, so I'd like to add that it is illegal under international law. It's tantamount to territorial conquest, which is forbidden by the UN Charter, regardless of percentage. So the percentages do not matter in terms of the legal definition. It is also a crime under the Rome Statute, because it's also changing the population of and the parameters of occupied territory. So from all vantage points, be it international law, from the PLO's reaction, represented by President Abbas, the Palestinian public, those of us who have experienced annexation in Jerusalem, and of course in the Golan Heights, as you mentioned, dating back to the 60s and 80s. All of this means that we feel robbed, and we are being robbed of our land, of our natural resources. The Jordan Valley also represents a major agricultural and trade route and territory, and not to mention the fact that it is our connection to the outside world vis-a-vis the West Bank, because as you very well know, West Bankers cannot travel through Israel, the international airports and so forth. So we only have a territorial land crossing into Jordan. So all trade, movement, livelihood, water, natural resources, the Dead Sea, with its minerals, everything is being implicated by a step of this nature. Now, as Khalil Shikaki mentioned, it appears to be on hold or paused, but it's still a threat. It doesn't mean that it is been stopped completely and totally. And it will continue to nibble at our core, and there lies the threat, of course. I'm not going. Also, I want to mention the fact that since Hamas was mentioned, even Hamas alluded to the fact that the annexation plan would create or present an opportunity for all forms of resistance. So. On all levels, and the international community, not to mention the fact that the international community has expressed a lot of concern over the annexation, and the activities of the of the PLO at the international level have garnered a lot of support to halt the current annexation, and seems to have resulted in a change, I wouldn't say a permanent change, but a temporary change in the US position over annexation. Again, all of this does not mean that it will not happen. Again, it's our Israeli colleague also mentioned that annexation has been ongoing all along. I'm not going to repeat everything that my colleagues have said, but I'll just mention a few other things in terms of how it's also seen as a factor and a major factor in threatening the resumption of any kind of negotiations. It will affect it will create territorial enclaves in the West Bank, create an apartheid system, and affects, again, the international border and the relationship with Jordan. And not to mention the fact that it will increase human rights violations. So from all of these aspects, any expansion of all of these illegal, anyways, settlements we all know have been dubbed illegal under international law and will hinder, so annexation will not legitimize them in the eyes of the Palestinians. They will be illegal. It's just the area will become even a greater and greater in terms of restricting the movement of Palestinians, restricting the freedom of Palestinians, and affecting also residency of the West Bankers who live in these areas. So far, we have an estimate that it will affect 100,000 plus Palestinians living in those areas. So it was from an Israeli perspective, I'm not going to comment on Israeli politics, of course, with our colleague being there, but from an Israeli perspective, it was an election, part of the election rhetoric of Mr. Netanyahu seems to have received support, although, but from a Palestinian perspective, again, I'll end on this, it will significantly affect our rights and affect the two-state solution or any prospect for a two-state solution. But perhaps this is where all of this is going, to undermine and to present or to give the blow, a final blow, so to speak, to the two-state solution. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Hiba. Am I unmuted? Yes, I am. Thanks very much, Hiba. I will turn shortly to the audience and to allow you to raise questions of your own, but I would like first to see if I can ask ask the panelists to engage one another with respect to some of the issues that you've raised. And the first question that I'd like to ask is for both Dr. Shikaki and for Hiba. Dr. Shikaki, back in 2014, your center published a very comprehensive survey that looked at the likely consequences of a Palestinian Authority collapse. And the picture that was painted in terms of public order, in terms of the economy, and in terms of security was not a pretty one. Today, in your remarks, you observed that the PA is increasingly seen more as a burden than as an asset, that its jurisdiction has been very severely hemmed in, and that its practices are increasingly authoritarian. We see observers in various parts of the world, most recently prominently articulated so we see observers in various parts of the world articulating the view that maybe it's better for the PA to collapse. And Amis, although he didn't articulate that point, did make the point that annexation might help to clear things up, to shake a situation that badly needs shaking. And so my question to you is whether you agree with those who are calling for the abolition of the PA at this juncture, whether you think shaking up the situation in the ways that this would involve could be beneficial with respect to the circumstances for both Palestinians and for Israelis.
If I begin to answer you, Omar, I personally would not want to see the PA collapsing or dissolved. And if, as it seems, we are, if Israel goes ahead with annexation, this becomes inevitable. The collapse of the Palestinian Authority, either by abdication of responsibility by Abbas and the Palestinian Authority, or by gradual weakening of the PA, steps that Israel might take, such as withholding the money, refusing to release it without coordination and so on. If that is to happen, the purpose of the 2014 studies, at that time we organized a task force, 10 task forces in fact, to look at 10 areas affecting Palestinian life, from security to finance, to local government, to education, health, communication, etc. These were experts from the government, outside the government, who basically in every team worked together to spell out the consequences. What happens if the PA collapses or is dissolved? And the picture that all the teams put together was indeed not a pleasant one. So but the purpose was not to make a decision whether we should or should not allow the PA to collapse, but what can we do so that if and when it is collapsed or is dissolved, how can we make life bearable for the Palestinian public after that moment? And so all the teams proposed ways and means in which the implications for the public would be, particularly on those areas where these implications could be extremely serious. How can we reduce the consequences as much as possible? So if we are to allow the PA to collapse, the PA must look into these areas and create in place, before it abdicates responsibility, those elements that will help the resilience of Palestinian society, making sure that the society will continue to aspire to achieve its rights as much as possible without collapsing, without a societal collapse. But I think as a policy measure, we should seek as much as we can as Palestinians to maintain the PA. Annexation is an Israeli decision. It forces the gradual collapse, I believe, of the Palestinian Authority, and it could lead to a decision of abdication, complete abdication of responsibility by the PA. My own assessment is that we are at this point not ready. We have not put in place those parameters, institutions, policy measures that we proposed in 2014 and 15 for the PA to take in anticipation of this day. So here we are 5, 6 years later, and we are facing that threat, not because of something we did, but because of something Israel and the Americans have done. And we are not prepared for the consequences.
Shall I comment, Omar?
That would be great.
Just very briefly. I mean, I totally agree with Dr. Shikaki, but I also will add, it's not just the annexation. I think the PA has been, its performance, its functions have been detracted from over years. So I think the lack of progress on any, and the lack of prospect for a settlement of the conflict, even within certain temporary arrangements or what have you, and the fact that the relationship continues to deteriorate between Israel and the Palestinians, again, as Dr. Shikaki, without alternatives, will have severe implications on the public, especially in the health and education sectors, not to mention civil society, civil affairs, day-to-day activities. But the PA is being slowly it's being devoid from its core functions, and it's, in my opinion, annexation and prolonged economic restrictions and now coupled with COVID and all of these current issues may lead to its collapse. And I agree that we have not worked to develop the alternatives nor the institutions that will address the ramifications. So it's inevitable. I don't know, I think we need to shake ourselves up a little bit, but not by annexation.
Okay, great. I'll come back to that in just a moment. I think that I saw a raised hand just a second ago. I will, okay. Yes, please, go ahead.
So first of all, just in terms of the format for questions and answers, if anybody has a question, just raise your hand, and I will see a raised hand, and I will unmute you. Just direct your question, if you can, towards either our moderator or any of the speakers, or all of the speakers as well. But I wanted to begin with a question, if possible. The conversation about annexation, of course, this event has been very enlightening, and it's interesting to hear how many of the different perspectives, you know, kind of basically, you know, promote the same message that annexation is bad for a number of reasons. All of them very valid. Now, my question is, over the course of the past, I would say over 70 years, this conversation about a Palestinian state emerging alongside the state of Israel has been taking place in a host of different formats: peace talks, memorandums of understanding, international agreements. Nothing of which managed to materialize in terms of a concrete Palestinian state, except for what exists today in one capacity or another. Now, the conversation taking place, to the best of my knowledge, under the Trump peace plan, calls for, as we said, 30% annexation to be replaced by, you know, potential land swaps, conversations of where that would take place in the Negev, other places, with a Palestinian state emerging on that 70%. That is left. Now, without getting into the specifics of the plan itself, is there no way to see this as a potential opportunity for the Palestinian people to finally be able to achieve that level of statehood that has been desired over the course of the past 70 years? Perhaps not in the most ideal way, but of course, you know, many people have discussed the Palestinian tendency to miss opportunity after opportunity, whether under Arafat or Abu Mazen. Even though the situation is not ideal, do we not, again, I'm addressing any of the speakers here, or all of the speakers, is there not a way to perhaps, nevertheless, despite all of the negative and all of the risks and everything discussed on this esteemed panel, to perhaps see it as an opportunity for the future of the Palestinian people, nevertheless? I'll unmute, I guess, all of the speakers in case anybody wants to address that question.
I can tell you what the Palestinian public thinks about your idea. The Palestinian public by 94% said no. We should not do that. I've never seen in 27 years of public opinion among Palestinians, I've never seen such consensus. For the Palestinians, this Trump plan does not lead to a Palestinian state. It leads to a Palestinian entity that is an Israeli protectorate under full Israeli control, encircled by Israel from all sides, has no real sovereignty. That it's essentially called a two-state solution, but in fact it is a one-state solution in reality, in which Palestinians denied equal rights with Israeli Jews. But in order to avoid having to address this issue of equality, they call it a two-state solution. You are not going to find any confusion among the Palestinians about this. So you can say they are determined to miss this opportunity to have this kind of a solution. The Palestinians, of course, think that it's Israel that is missing the opportunity to have a solution. The Palestinians who have, for a long time in this conflict, for more than 100 years, the Palestinians demanded the entire land between the river and the sea. And then one day they said, okay, we give up, we just accept 22% of historic Palestine, and we're ready to live in peace, security, and cooperation with the state of Israel. And the state of Israel says, no, we will not give you the 22%. We will want to take more of your land. I think if you look at it this way, and this is how Palestinians look at it, that's different from the way you looked at it. And in this sense, the Palestinians say, well, we've given the Israelis one opportunity after the other. Since 1988, we've accepted 242, accepted partition, agreed to a state in just 22% of the land, agreed to equal territorial swaps, they are minor, agreed that the refugees will have a home in the state of Palestine, agreed that the state of Palestine will be demilitarized, and Israelis miss the opportunity one time after the other. So you see, the Palestinian narrative is the exact same narrative as your narrative, but it's understanding things the other way around. And this kind of miscommunication between the two sides, of course, have contributed to the continuation of the conflict, because each side looks at it from its own perspective, and the two narratives strongly affect what choices they ultimately make.
Thanks very much, Khalil. Ami, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, as an answer to the question, I'll be very short. The question, you have an assumption that we have been trying for the last 60 or 70 years and it didn't work. Now, let me tell you the truth, we did not try. I don't want to go to the history and to the narratives. Khalil did something about it, both sides, but I'm speaking as an Israeli. And the proof that we didn't try, we built settlements. Without settlements, you could try to defend your assumption. Okay, there is a security problem, we don't want to be attacked, and this is why we have to occupy all the territories. Once we started to build settlements, it is not a security question. So to tell us, Israelis and Palestinians, from someone who looks on us from a different planet, look, I see you, you tried and it didn't work. No, you don't see what really happened during the last 70 years. We did not try. By the way, just to emphasize the idea of the correlation between crisis and opportunities, and in a way, this was what you asked, if I understand, Dajani, Professor Dajani. I believe that there is a big opportunity here. But the opportunity is presented to us, and I don't see enough of us understand. We understand the reality today. America is not or cannot lead any process today. At least not a process which is accepted by both sides. Now, the international community will have to understand that once suddenly we speak about it, and Israelis and Palestinians understand the impact and the long-term consequences. For Israel, it means that Israel will not be a democracy. And by the way, if we see a reality of one state or whatever, it will not be a Jewish either or neither. So I think that to come up with some ideas that are not new, by the way. I think that the quartet does not exist today. We shall not know what is happening on the international level until November. Whether in Israel we shall have elections, whether in America we shall have elections, it is very, very important who will be the next American president, and whether in Europe, Russia, UN, with all the pandemic and the economic crisis, there is some energy in order to present some ideas which are based on the concept of two states, but will be led by the quartet and not by America.
Thanks very much. Joseph, did you want to speak for a moment about procedure going forward?
Thank you. So we're just going to slightly change things for the audience Q&A, how we're asking questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, go to the participants bit at the bottom of your screen and click raise hand. And that will let Professor Dajani know that you want to ask a question, and then he'll select from there. I think he has one more question just before we go to the general audience one. So yeah, back to you. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Joseph. This question really is just a follow-up, Ami, to what you offered just a moment ago. As you described earlier, the trajectory that we're on is not one that was born in 2019 when Netanyahu announced plans to annex de jure. There's been a process of de facto annexation happening for a long time. And I confess that I have some anxiety that all the attention focused on de jure annexation distracts us from the unfolding reality on the ground and the consequences for Palestinians and Israelis. The question, though, that I struggle with is how the international community can most effectively affect Israeli public opinion. We see that the United States, not only on the Republican side, but even on the Democratic side, has found it difficult to articulate a strong position with respect to these questions. It said no to annexation, but hasn't even found it possible on the Democratic platform to utter the word occupation. And we've seen a somewhat fumbling approach from the rest of the world with respect to a concrete response, condemnation, but without real consequences. And so I guess the question for you, if I can put it most sort of simply, is how do we affect Israeli public opinion in the way that you suggest will be necessary in order for us to shift this trajectory in a different direction?
For me?
Yes, for you.
Well, I believe that it's probably the best way, and I'm saying the best because I think that to punish Israel might create a double effect. You know, it's too many Israelis will deepen their, I don't know, position. Too many Israelis see or believe that no matter what we shall do, you know, the world is against us, the anti-Semitism, etc., etc. I think that the best or the most practical step should be just to announce that Palestine is a state and to accept Palestine as a full member in the UN. I think that most Israelis do not believe that we should see it. But for years, by the way, I used to say that I think that Israel should do it, because I think that it is much better to negotiate with a state than with administration or organization that is much weaker. But this is, as I mentioned, I'm a minority in Israel. I think that to announce every state, France, England, probably after the elections in America, America will not veto in the Security Council. So I think that this is what the international community, as the first reaction, and to say it, by the way, to say it here now, it will be much more threatening to Israelis than sanctions or whatever, because I'm not sure that, you know, behind sanctions there are really states in the region and in Europe that believe that economic connections with Israel are very important, and they are not very, they don't want to pay the price. So politically, just to put it on the map.
Thanks very much, Ami. So we already have a few questions, a few people in line. Right now in the queue, I have Naman first, and then Shazia, hello, and then Josh. And so Naman, I will ask Shlomo to unmute you, and feel free to ask your question.
Hi, so my question is, does anyone think there are any insights to be learned from the annexation of the Golan Heights and perhaps other ones across the world, say Western Sahara, Crimea, but especially Golan Heights? Yeah.
Anyone like to speak to that?
It's okay. I don't think that we can learn something from the Golan Heights. It's totally different. There are few. I mean, on the Golan Heights, the people who are living, most of them are Druze, and I don't think that the Druze do not see themselves as people. Some of them believe that they are Syrians. Some of them can accept Israeli citizenship as many of them did. So I don't think that we can see any parallel and we can learn something from what the annexation of the Golan Heights.
If I can add something there, Naaman, what you might consider looking at is a really excellent paper that Dalia Shendlin wrote for the Century Foundation, in which she takes a look at precedents with respect to annexation across the world and examines the different responses to them, and also considers their implications with respect to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And what she sees, and there are a number of different conclusions that she draws that are important, but one thing that I think is striking is to look closely at the incredibly variable international reaction and how rooted it is in alliances and economic relationships. And so we see fierce condemnation of annexations in some contexts, and rather less fierce ones in others. And where you have anodyne responses to annexation, unsurprisingly, you see very little intention to reverse what's actually the steps that have been taken. But I do urge you to have a look at that.
Can I respond to that, Omar?
Of course, Khalil, yes.
I think for the Palestinian public, Naaman, what they see is that Israel was able to get away with that. Israel succeeded in annexing the Golan Heights with very little international sanctions against it. it is true that no country has recognized it. Israel did not incur a significant price in terms of how the international community responded. And this is what Palestinians think is going to happen this time. Not only from the international community, but even from the Palestinian neighbors. Most Palestinians believe that the Arab countries will essentially do nothing if Israel goes ahead with annexation, and that therefore the Palestinians have no one but themselves to rely on to respond. This is why we see such dramatic proposals by the public, including resort to violence in response to the Israeli annexation. The Palestinians believe that this is an existential threat to them, and that the PA should respond, and the entire Palestinian community should respond in a very effective manner, and should not expect the international community to step forward to do anything, sanctions or otherwise, against Israel, that only the Palestinians can protect their interests.
Thanks very much, Khalil. Next in line, we have Shazia.
Hello. So would the speakers have some insight as to how the Israeli Arabs who have citizenship in Israel would view an annexation with unequal citizenship? Would it be viewed as something we've seen in Kashmir, where you are citizens of India, but you are next in line for removal of some rights later on? And just secondly, with the UK splitting from the European Union, but still having a vote on the Security Council with a government that is close to Trump in some ways, is their role changing when it comes to the quartet later, if at all? Thank you.
I believe that Khalil can give the answer as good as I am, as I can. I think that in all his polls, we see that annexation is a threat to the Israeli Arab community. By the way, there is a very interesting debate among Israelis when it comes to the Israeli Arabs about a kind of identity question. Who are you? Are you Arabs, Palestinians, Muslims, Israelis? Who are you? And it depends, I came to understand that it depends when you ask the question. And the way I understand them, if you will ask the question immediately after that Israel will annex, every Israeli Arab will tell you, I'm a Palestinian first. And only later, I don't know, I'm an Israeli. So they see Palestinians are people, even if some of them are Israeli citizens. In America, by the way, Jews and Jewish communities can understand it. They do care about Israel. If Israel will be attacked, they will do whatever they can. Many of them will come to fight, as we saw in the past. I believe that Israeli Arabs will not be able to sit and to think that it is somebody else's problem. This is the way I understand it. Khalil, what do you think?
You're absolutely right, Tommy. The surveys that have been conducted so far since the release of the Trump plan show a similar consensus among Israeli Arabs against the plan and against annexation, in part because of this question, the question of the right to citizenship, to equal rights. And the Trump plan, if you might remember, opens the possibility for several Arab towns adjacent to the Green Line to become part of the Palestinian state, and essentially meaning that they are no longer Israeli citizens without even asking them whether they would be interested in doing that. And the idea, as Netanyahu indicated recently, as Ami said, that those Palestinians who happen to live in the areas that will be annexed by Israel will not be granted Israeli citizenship or equal rights, raises all kinds of alarms that the state of Israel would treat other Palestinians in this manner, threaten to transfer them into a different country, not theirs, which they consider Israel to be their country, or to deny, to be able to legally, for the country to say to somebody, you live in the country, but you are not a citizen or do not have equal rights. This is a huge threat to Israeli Arabs. So for the Israeli Arabs, annexation, the Trump plan is essentially a threat to their own future, and not just to the stability of their status in the state of Israel.
Look, well, I was the chairman of the University of Haifa for 6 years, and every time when we had an operation in Gaza, students went to the street or to the streets of the university, and I met them in demonstrations, and they told me, look, how do you want us to behave when our friends from the university are killing our people in Gaza? So, by the way, as the former director of the Shin Bet, in this future scenario, we might see terror in the Galilee, in the Negev, and in Wadi Ara, not only in Gaza, Samaria, and Judea.
Thanks very much to both of you. Let me turn to Josh, who has his hand up.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for calling me, Omar. You know, as everyone here studies this very in depth, and Netanyahu has been in power since 2009, Abbas been in power since 2005, it feels like stalemate for us hoping for a better future. I wanted to know from people who, with specific names, are politicians among the Palestinians and Israelis who can bring about peace, who we should, be rooting for, who can come into leadership to do that.
Thanks very much, Josh. Hiba, would you like to start with the Palestinian peacemakers?
Oh my goodness, Omar. Well, I think, let me put it this way. I think the name is not as important as the opportunity. Should the opportunity present itself and offer a genuine process to reaching a negotiated agreement where it's not unilateral actions, where it's not the threat of annexation, where it's not the one that would address Jerusalem, refugees, borders, sovereignty, everything, I think you will find a host of Palestinian leaders who will rise to the occasion. I doubt very much if it's a question of a personality, true personality, charisma plays a factor. But I think our leaders have been delegitimized over the years and dubbed to be no partner to peace simply because these opportunities we're discussing today and in the past have not presented themselves.
Thanks very much, Hiba. Khalil, would you like to speak to that? And in the process, it would be interesting to hear you reflect on whether one such name that fits in both categories is Ayman Odeh.
Indeed, why not? I think that's a very good example. I can tell you that since 2000, Israeli-Palestinian negotiations all the way up to 2008 have seen gradual progress, although we did not reach a peace agreement. But compared to where the positions of the two sides were before 2000, by 2008, there was significant, in 2008, the Israeli Prime Minister at that time was Ehud Olmert, and the Palestinian president was his counterpart, the current Palestinian president, Abbas. Both men made significant concessions compared to the positions that they or their government have taken before that. In 2008, myself and my Israeli counterpart at that time, we were working jointly with the Hebrew University, and my colleague at the Hebrew University at that time and I did 5 surveys in 2008 for both Abbas and Olmert to show them where the two societies were, the Israeli and the Palestinian societies. And I can tell you that 2008 showed significant Israeli and Palestinian public support for these ideas that these two men, Abbas and Olmert, were negotiating. Have conditions continued as they were, our findings were recorded in mid-2008. So we started sometime in March or April 2008 and ended in August for these surveys before we presented them to the two sides. There was significant public willingness to accept these ideas. We presented both societies with an identical end of conflict agreement that resolved all the issues and included extremely painful concessions that both sides were required. These were not ideas we created. These were ideas that we heard from the negotiators, and they wanted us to test whether there was public support for the ideas. I can tell you that 60% or more of Israeli Jews, 90% of Israeli Arabs, and 60% or more of Palestinians supported these ideas. And I can tell you, if Abbas and Olmert continued to negotiate further that year, I would have been, by mid-2008, I was very optimistic that they would, based on the surveys that we were conducting. So conditions deteriorated and Olmert was no longer a prime minister right at the point where significant progress was being made. So as Hiba said, it is the opportunity. Was there an opportunity in 2008? The answer is absolutely yes, but it was not fully accomplished because of changes within Israel at that time and the charges of corruption that were brought against Olmert. In 2013 and 14, we did not see as much progress when the Obama administration tried to resume the negotiations. What I'm saying is, it is definitely the people. There's no doubt that Arafat and Rabin were people who could affect change, who could make decisions that are fundamentally different than what the kind of decisions they made earlier, and that allowed them then to work with their public to begin to change attitudes. And I think that Olmert and Abbas were very close to doing that in 2008. So both the circumstances and the leadership, I believe, are extremely important. I would add to that, of course, the domestic conditions. That is part of the circumstances. Over the last decade, this is when essentially the right-wing government of Netanyahu had assumed power. We've seen a huge but gradual increase in distrust of the two societies of each other, and the belief that there is no partner on the other side, neither at the leadership level nor at the public level. This has been very destructive to the willingness to compromise We find in recent surveys, however, that we've conducted jointly with colleagues at Tel Aviv University. These were surveys that were conducted between 2016 and 2018. We did 5 waves of experiments among the two publics, in which when we offered incentives and means of restoring the trust between the two sides, we found significant willingness to compromise with ideas that identical proposals for a solution presented to both sides in 16, 17, and 18, these years in which these experiments were conducted. And we start with very little support from both societies because of this trust. Once we begin to work on the incentives and on trying to change attitudes regarding the question of trust, we could find that we can get support rising from 40% or even less to 60 and 70% on both sides, supporting the same document that contains an agreement with very painful concessions, similar to those that the two sides were presented with in 2008. So the domestic conditions, of course, are important, but given the lack of trust that is currently prevailing, you should not expect public opinion to be a force for peace or a leader for peace. You would want leaders to lead. At this point, unfortunately, leaders are not leading. And they are expecting the public essentially to lead them because they are trying to appease the public. That is not the kind of condition that prevailed, by the way, in 1992-93, when the Israelis and Palestinians began to negotiate at a moment in which there was no public support for a lot of these ideas that they were negotiating. So Arafat and Rabin did show leadership. They didn't wait for the public to lead. But today, unfortunately, I do not see that kind of leadership from our own side or from the Israeli side. I see them afraid of public opinion, not willing to make any decisions that would rock the boat. Nonetheless, I can't say that Abbas is an impediment to peace. I can't say that Abbas would oppose an agreement because of the kind of concessions he was willing to make with the Olmert government in 2008. I don't see him as an impediment. I see Netanyahu as an impediment because Netanyahu knew where the two sides were and how close in 2008 they were. When he became prime minister in 2009, he refused to continue that process. He refused to sit down with Abbas and continue the process of negotiations from where the two sides left off. That is not an indication of a man who wants to lead towards peace.
Thanks very much, Khalil. I know that we'll have to stop in just a moment. Ami, did you want to offer a brief response to that question?
I totally agree with Khalil. The name is not very important. I'm sure that he was born already. I'm not sure exactly how old he is, but he's grown up. What is important is the process, because the correlation that Khalil mentioned, the more people will see it viable, the more they support it. So, and again, the example of Olmert, Olmert did many mistakes. By the way, he lost his position as the prime minister, not because his agreement with Arafat, or yeah, with Abu Mazen, sorry, but because of corruption. So one of the conditions, he should not be corrupted, because he will lose his position in Israel. By the way, I believe that it will happen with Netanyahu the same, but it takes time. So, and yes, Khalil mentioned it, he will have to understand that he is putting his future on the line, because along the process, in order to create the support, he will lose some of the political power. So this is something that politicians today are hate to do, and but in order to take it forward, this is the price that he will have to pay.
Thanks very much, Ami. So we've heard a lot about the worrying path that Israel and Palestine are on right now, about the dangers presented by annexation, about the dangers presented by the continuing situation of de facto annexation, even without it being formalized, and about the worrying transformation in public opinion on both sides of the Green Line. Those are cause for a lot of concern on all of our parts. At the end, it sounded like we had a few words of, if not optimism, hopefulness shared by the participants who expressed, who reminded us that it wasn't so long ago that the publics were in very substantial proportions in a similar place as far as reaching peace is concerned. And while they're no longer at that place, there is the possibility that they can be led. We haven't found that person, but we hope that he or she will emerge soon. And we also hope that the discourse that we're seeing unfolding in other places, in the United States being one, around justice and its demands, will have an influence on the way things unfold in Israel and Palestine. So with all of that said, I wanted to thank once again the organizers of this session, and to thank the three speakers, hhusseini and Amichay Ayalon and Khalil Shikaki. And I will stop there. Joseph, did you have any closing words you wanted to offer?
Yeah, thank you also to all of our speakers and to the people who asked questions, and to our audience for coming along. And thank you to Professor Dajani for an excellent job leading this event. That's very kind of you to take that role on. So thank you very much. Just looking forward now, so keep an eye on our Facebook for more events. There'll be several more over the course of what for Cambridge is the summer holidays at the moment, moving into September. And also on our website, there's the opportunity to sign up for our new news update, which is a weekly roundup of news from the Middle East and North Africa. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming along. Thank you again to our speakers. Cheers.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.